Free trade has taken a hit on the campaign trail this year. Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, and to some extent Hillary Clinton all have had unkind words about the impact of free trade on the American economy. Our next guest offers a different perspective. Scott Lincicome is an international trade attorney. He's also a visiting lecturer at Duke University and an adjunct scholar at the libertarian Cato Institute. He recently spoke to the John Locke Foundation on Freedman Legacy Day, a day devoted to one of the world's foremost advocates of free trade, the late economist Milton Friedman. Scott, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, free trade. We've been hearing quite a bit more about trade and the impact of trade than we have in recent campaigns. And I see you smiling. The people listening to us can't see the smile, but it's kind of a wry smile that we're hearing probably more for the wrong reasons than you'd want to hear.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not hearing about free trade because all of the presidential candidates are out there cheering it. It is, without a doubt, the worst political climate for free trade in the last few decades. And that has demonstrated kind of the collapse of what we call the pro-trade consensus in American politics, at least, in favor of open trade and free trade agreements.
And in fact, if people haven't been following this very closely, you could look back just a couple of decades ago, and both major parties supported free trade. Now both major parties have major people who have questions or outright concerns or hostility to trade.
Yeah, and it's not even a few decades. I mean, really, the pro-trade consensus goes all the way back to the 1940s. You know, the establishment of the global trading system through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, what we now call the World Trade Organization, was begun by Secretary of State Cordell Hull as part of the FDR administration. This was the WTO was created to foment a global stability in the trading system to avoid the kind of trade wars and tit-for-tat protectionism that led to real wars. So, looking back through the last few decades, you saw not just Democrats, but also Republicans. President Kennedy was a huge free trader to President Reagan, obviously. And then, of course, lately, both President Bush's, President Bill Clinton, and even President Obama has come around on trade, now supporting the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement.
Now, with all of the discussion about free trade, what should people know about trade and its impact?
Well, sure. I think the thing that we miss in today's debate is a very simple understanding of what trade really is. Political candidates in particular talk about trade as if it is this zero-sum battle between countries. So China is doing this to America and we're losing. You hear that a lot, especially from Donald Trump. We're losing at trade. Well, this actually fundamentally misunderstands what trade is. The fact is that trade is simply a voluntary economic transaction between individuals, not between countries. And it's done on that individual basis. Protectionism, on the other hand, is when the government gets in the way of that transaction. So that can be whether it be between us here in Raleigh and someone in Durham, or someone in Washington, D.C., or someone in China. The only thing that changes there is the border you're crossing. And we lose sight of that because instead of talking about this very basic thing that we individuals entering into voluntary, mutually beneficial transactions, we talk about it in terms that are so obfuscating that very simple reality.
We're speaking with Scott Lincicome. He is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, visiting lecturer at Duke University, and an international trade attorney by trade. One of the things that seems to be a problem in the discussion about trade is a move away from the focus on the consumer.
Yeah.
Because when we have free trade, the ultimate beneficiary tends to be the consumer, doesn't it?
Yeah, dating back to Adam Smith. That's one of the fundamental. It's another fundamental misunderstanding about trade. And this actually, really, the blame falls on free traders, at least free traders in politics and in the business community. They always have tried to sell trade through a obsessive focus on exports and on opening foreign markets through reciprocal free trade agreements. Well, that paints trade as kind of a zero-sum mercantilist game in which our big corporations are trying to export lots of goods and services to other countries. But like you said, the biggest beneficiaries of trade are consumers. In fact, a recent study showed that about 90% of the consumer gains to trade go not to big multinational corporations, but to poor and middle-class consumers. And again, if you step back and stop talking about the numbers and you think about this, it makes good sense. Poor and middle-class consumers have very tight budgets, and they shop at places like Walmart and Target and buy imported goods. So when the price of that good goes down, they have more money, more wealth, really, because they can stretch their budget further. So when you impose protectionist trade barriers and you raise the price of goods, and typically that's the result of lobbying by well-connected industries and their lobbyists in Washington, D.C., the result is higher prices. When those prices go up, who gets hurt the most? Well, again, it's the poor and middle-class consumer. These are American families. The other thing that we miss is consumers also mean businesses. About half of everything we import are things used by American manufacturers to produce other goods and remain globally competitive doing so. So when you raise the price of things like steel, well, that means refrigerators and automobiles get more expensive. It also means that those refrigerator producers or auto producers might look to move offshore where they can get cheaper inputs or, of course, better tax or regulatory policy.
You mentioned earlier that for years and years, decades in fact, major players in both major parties saw the benefits of trade. Yeah. What happened and how do we get back to the right situation?
Well, how we get back is a very difficult thing, but we can really pinpoint how it happened. It started in the late 90s with the Democratic Party. You really saw from the party of Bill Clinton move sharply away from support for free trade. And if you look at the Democratic Party platform, in fact, from about 96 to 2008, it went from supportive of free trade to basically parroting the anti-globalization movement. So they certainly deserve some of the blame, as does President Obama, really. Although he's pushing the TPP today, for his first 6 years or so, the president condoned discrete protectionism, imposed a little bit of it his own through on Chinese tires and other things, and really never spent any political capital defending free trade. It's only been recently. And the president is kind of the guy for that job because he represents the nation as a whole. And so by abdicating that, you saw a vacuum that no one really filled. But then finally, there really needs to be blame placed on pro-trade advocates in Congress and in the business community that failed to explain the full picture of trade, about the benefits of imports, not just exports, about the morality of trade and the immorality of protectionism. By leaving these things out, they essentially sowed the seeds of their own destruction. Trade, I joke, is the only issue I've ever heard of where the good guys, the free traders, essentially not only concede the bad guys' arguments, but actually implicitly support them through their own rhetoric, talking about trade surpluses and export promotion and so forth. So when you do that, it really makes it difficult to win the rhetorical battle. And then finally, there's been a bipartisan failure of policy. We are still using the same types of reciprocal free trade agreements that we used 30 and 40 years ago, even though the global economy has changed dramatically, and in particular, these rapidly evolving global supply chains, where your iPhone is assembled in China but made from parts from Japan and the United States and elsewhere, using engineers and marketers from Apple in Cupertino, California. Yet our free trade agreements tend to be rigid bilateral or small regional deals that just simply don't reflect the modern global economy. At the same time, we haven't done anything related to our tax policy. We have the highest corporate taxes in the world. Our regulatory policy, where we're imposing large regulatory burdens on not just corporations, but also workers. As I wrote in National Review, there are so many things that the federal government does in terms of policy to actually discourage a beneficial churn in the labor market. So what these things do basically is prevent or discourage workers from looking for a new and innovative job, or when disaster strikes, from finding and training for a new job. So essentially, here in North Carolina, the example would be a textile worker. Instead of finding a new job in an innovative field like information technology, federal policy actually encourages that worker to stay in a field that is dying not because of trade, but because of productivity gains and simply changing consumer tastes.